Story 1. It was a beautiful autumn day when a group of friends decided to go on a hiking trip in the woods. They were all excited for the adventure, but little did they know that it would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. The group started off on the trail, enjoying the stunning scenery around them. The leaves on the trees had turned to brilliant shades of orange and red, and the air was crisp and refreshing. They chatted and laughed, feeling invigorated by the outdoor experience. As they continued along the path, the woods grew thicker, and the trees became taller and darker. The group soon realized that they had strayed off the trail and were lost in the woods. Panic began to set in as they tried to find their way back, but they only seemed to be getting further and further away from civilization. As the sun began to set, the group stumbled upon a clearing with a dilapidated cabin in the center. They were hesitant to enter, but as the darkness closed in around them, they decided it was their only option. The inside of the cabin was decrepit and dusty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. The air was musty and smelled of decay. The group decided to spend the night there and try to find their way back to the trail in the morning. As the night wore on, strange noises started to fill the cabin. The floorboards creaked, and the wind howled outside. The group huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. It sounded like someone was being tortured or murdered. The group was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. As the screaming continued, they realized that they were not alone in the woods. Something or someone was out there, and it was coming for them. The group tried to leave the cabin, but the door was stuck shut. They were trapped, with no way to escape. The screaming outside grew louder and more intense, and the group knew that they were running out of time. Just when they thought it was all over, the screaming abruptly stopped, and the cabin fell silent. The group was paralyzed with fear, not knowing what was going to happen next. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the group finally managed to break open the door and run back to civilization. They never spoke of their terrifying experience in the woods again, but they knew that something evil was lurking out there, waiting for its next victim. Years later, hikers still report strange sightings and eerie sounds in those same woods, and some believe that the spirits of those who have been lost there still haunt the area to this day. The legend of the lost in the woods continues, a warning to all who dare to enter the wilderness unprepared. Story 2. It was a beautiful summer day when a group of friends decided to go camping in the woods. They were all excited for the adventure, but little did they know that it would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. The group set up camp and started to enjoy the serene surroundings. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing, creating a peaceful atmosphere. As night fell, they started a campfire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. As the night wore on, the woods grew darker and quieter, and the group retired to their tents to get some rest. But one of the campers, John, couldn't sleep. He kept feeling like something was watching him from the shadows. John tried to shake off the feeling and focus on sleeping, but as the night progressed, the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound outside his tent. He froze, unsure of what to do. The rustling sound continued, and John slowly unzipped his tent, peeking outside. He saw a shadow moving in the woods, and it seemed to be getting closer to the campsite. John tried to alert his friends, but they were all fast asleep. As the shadow drew closer, John realized that it was not a natural shadow cast by the moonlight. It was a living shadow, moving independently of any object. The shadow was getting closer and closer, and John could feel his heart racing with fear. Suddenly, the shadow disappeared, and John was left standing in the darkness, alone and terrified. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still out there, watching him. The next morning, The group packed up their belongings and left the woods, shaken by the events of the previous night. They didn't speak of the shadow to anyone, afraid that no one would believe them. Years passed, and John still couldn't shake off the memory of the shadow in the woods. He became obsessed with researching the paranormal, hoping to find an explanation for what he saw. One day, John stumbled upon an old book that described a creature known as a shadow stalker. According to the book, the shadow stalker was a demonic creature that lived in the shadows and fed on human fear. John realized that the creature he saw in the woods that night was indeed a shadow stalker, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the shadow stalker was still out there, waiting for its next victim. From that day on, John made it his mission to warn others about the dangers of the shadow stalker. He knew that the creature was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And so, the legend of the shadow stalker in the woods was born, a warning to all who dared to venture into the darkness alone. For John, the memory of the shadow stalker would haunt him for the rest of his life, a reminder that some things are best left undiscovered. Story 3. It was a clear autumn day when a group of 4 friends decided to go hiking in the woods. They were all excited for the adventure, but little did they know that it would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. The group set off early in the morning, with backpacks filled with food, water, and supplies for their day trip. The woods were beautiful, with colorful leaves and the smell of fresh pine in the air. As they walked deeper into the forest, they marveled at the natural beauty around them. As the day wore on, the group found themselves venturing further and further off the beaten path. The woods grew darker and more foreboding, and the trail they were following became harder and harder to navigate. But they pressed on, determined to reach the summit of the mountain. As the sun began to set, the group realized that they were lost. They had no idea where they were or how to get back to their car. Panic set in, and they started to argue with each other, each blaming the others for getting them into this situation. As night fell, the group found themselves in a dense part of the forest, with no moonlight to guide them. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the woods. It was a scream like no other, filled with agony and despair. The group froze, unsure of what to do. They tried to follow the sound of the scream, hoping to find whoever was in trouble and help them. But the scream kept moving, as if it was leading them deeper into the woods. As they walked, the group started to feel like they were being watched. They could feel eyes on them, even though they couldn't see anyone. The forest seemed to be alive with a malevolent energy, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the screaming stopped, and the woods fell silent once again. The group was left standing in the darkness, unsure of what had just happened. They tried to turn back, but the trail they had been following was gone. It was as if the woods had swallowed it up. As they wandered through the darkness, the group started to notice strange symbols carved into the trees around them. They seemed to be ancient symbols of some kind, and they were marked in a dark, viscous substance that oozed like blood. The symbols led them deeper into the woods, and as they walked, they started to see strange, shadowy figures moving in the darkness. They looked like human shapes, but they were twisted and distorted, as if they were made of shadows and nightmares. The figures seemed to be following them, closing in from all sides. The group started to run, but the figures kept pace with them, their movements fluid and unnatural. As they ran, the group suddenly found themselves at the edge of a cliff. The figures were closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. The group was trapped, with the shadows closing in for the kill. Suddenly, the figures disappeared, and the group was left standing in the darkness, alone and terrified. They could hear the sound of their own heartbeats pounding in their ears, as they realized that they had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that should have never been disturbed. The next morning, the group was found by a rescue team, huddled together at the bottom of the cliff. They were traumatized by their experience, unable to speak of what they had seen. But one thing was clear: the woods were not safe. As the group continued on their hike, they noticed that the forest became increasingly dense and the air grew colder. They started to hear strange noises in the distance, like the sound of a woman's scream. At first, they thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But as they got deeper into the woods, the screams grew louder and more frequent. The group tried to ignore the screams and focus on getting out of the woods, but the eerie sound seemed to be following them. They couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, the group heard a loud, blood-curdling scream coming from just ahead of them. They froze in terror, unsure of what to do. Then, they heard a voice calling out to them from the darkness. "Help me. Please, somebody help me." One of the group members, a man named Tom, bravely stepped forward and called out to the voice, asking if they needed help. The voice responded, "Please, help me. I'm lost and I can't find my way out of the woods." Tom and a few others cautiously made their way towards the voice, using flashlights to guide their way. As they got closer, they saw a figure in the distance, a woman dressed in a white dress, her hair disheveled and her face covered in scratches and dirt. The woman begged them to help her, saying that she had been lost in the woods for days and had nowhere else to turn. She looked so frail and helpless that the group couldn't help but feel sorry for her. They decided to take her back to their campsite and give her food and water. As they walked back to their camp, the woman kept thanking them, saying that they had saved her life. But as they got closer to their campsite, something strange started to happen. The woman's demeanor started to change, and she began to act strangely. Her eyes started to glow, and her voice became deeper and more guttural. The group members started to feel uneasy, sensing that something was not right. Then, they saw the woman's feet, or what was left of them. They were hoofs, like that of a goat. The group members realized too late that they had made a grave mistake. The woman they had rescued was not a woman at all, but a demon in disguise. They had unknowingly invited a monster into their campsite. The demon attacked them, its screams filling the night air as it tore apart their tents and belongings. The group members ran for their lives, barely escaping with their lives. From that day on, the group members never ventured into the woods again. They had learned their lesson the hard way, that sometimes the things we fear are not just in our imagination, but real and deadly. The screaming in the woods was a warning to all who dared to venture into the unknown, a reminder that not all strangers can be trusted. Story 4. It was a dark and stormy night when 3 teenagers decided to venture into the forbidden Blackfeather Woods. The locals always warned against going there, claiming that strange and terrible things happened in the woods. But the 3 friends, eager for adventure, didn't listen to the warnings and set out anyway. They had heard rumors about a hidden cabin deep in the woods, where a family of witches once lived. The cabin was said to be cursed, and anyone who entered it never returned. The teenagers thought it would be exciting to investigate the cabin and uncover its secrets. As they made their way through the dense forest, the rain began to pour down harder, and the wind howled through the trees. The only light came from their flashlights, which barely illuminated the path in front of them. Despite the harsh conditions, they pushed forward, driven by their curiosity. Finally, they reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be. Sure enough, there it was, standing in the center of the clearing, old and decrepit, with a large black feather hanging over the door. The teenagers approached the cabin cautiously, and as they stepped inside, they were hit by an overwhelming sense of dread. The interior was dark and musty, with strange symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Suddenly, they heard a rustling noise coming from upstairs. The friends froze in fear, unsure of what to do. They could hear faint whispers and the sound of footsteps moving around the upper floor. The noises continued for what felt like hours, until finally, they stopped. The friends breathed a sigh of relief, but then they heard a blood-curdling scream that shook them to their core. They knew they had to leave the cabin immediately, but when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The room grew colder, and they could see their breath in front of them. The black feather over the door began to glow, illuminating the room in an eerie light. The symbols on the walls started to pulse, and the cabin seemed to come alive. The friends huddled together, praying for their survival. They heard strange voices whispering in their ears, telling them to stay and become a part of the cabin's curse. But they refused to give up, and after what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly opened, and they were able to escape. As they stumbled out of the cabin and back into the woods, they could still hear the whispers and the sound of the family of witches who once lived there. They never spoke of what they experienced that night, but the memory of the cabin and the curse it held would haunt them forever. Story 5. It was a warm summer night when 5 friends decided to go camping in the woods. They had heard about a beautiful clearing deep in the forest, where they could pitch their tents and spend the night under the stars. As they made their way through the dense woods, the sky grew darker, and they could hear strange noises coming from the trees. But they brushed it off, thinking it was just the sounds of the wilderness. Finally, they reached the clearing and set up their tents. They started a campfire, roasted marshmallows, and talked for hours. But as the night went on, they started to hear a strange melody coming from the woods. It was a haunting tune, like nothing they had ever heard before. The melody grew louder and louder, and they could hear the sound of footsteps coming closer and closer. Suddenly, they saw a figure emerge from the darkness, playing an old wooden flute. He was an old man, dressed in tattered clothes, with a wild look in his eyes. He played the flute with such skill that it was mesmerizing, and the friends couldn't take their eyes off him. But as the melody continued, they started to feel uneasy. They could sense that something was not right. The old man played on, and the friends couldn't move, paralyzed by the music. Hours went by, and the friends lost track of time. They were entranced by the melody, and their minds were consumed by it. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the old man suddenly stopped playing and disappeared into the woods. The friends were left shaken and confused, unsure of what had just happened. They packed up their tents and left the clearing, eager to get away from the strange melody and the old man who played it. But as they walked through the woods, they could still hear the melody echoing in their minds. They tried to forget about it, but it haunted them, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they had been touched by something otherworldly. Years went by, and the friends went their separate ways. But they all carried the memory of the melody with them, and it continued to haunt them. They would hear it in their dreams, in the sound of the wind, and in the rustling of leaves. And as they grew older, they realized that the old man and his flute had not been real. It was a trick of the woods, a curse that had been placed on them that night. The melody was the music of the forest, and it had claimed them as its own. From that day on, they were forever changed, haunted by the melody and the memory of the old man who played it. And they knew that they could never escape the woods or the music that lived within it. Story 6. Deep in the heart of Beloia's forest, there was a legend of a cursed vase that had been hidden away for centuries. Many had heard of it, but few had ever dared to seek it out. They said that the vase had the power to grant wishes, but at a terrible cost. Those who possessed it would be plagued by nightmares, and their lives would be forever tainted by darkness. One day, a young couple named Peter and Maria decided to go on a hike in the forest. They had heard the legends of the cursed vase and were intrigued by the idea of finding it. As they walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, and the air grew colder. But they pressed on, determined to find the vase. Finally, after hours of searching, they stumbled upon an old cabin. It was dark and musty, with cobwebs covering the windows. But something drew them inside. They searched every room, but found nothing of interest. That is, until they came upon a hidden door in the back of the cabin. Behind the door, they found a small room with a pedestal in the center. On top of the pedestal sat the cursed vase. It was made of an ancient, twisted wood, and it emanated a sense of malevolence that made their skin crawl. But they couldn't resist the allure of its power. Maria picked up the vase and held it close. She closed her eyes and made a wish, but when she opened them again, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The trees outside the cabin were dead and withered, and the sky had turned a sickly shade of green. Peter tried to take the vase from her, but he found that he couldn't. It was as if it was glued to her hands. And as they tried to leave the cabin, they found that the door was locked, and they were trapped inside. They spent the night in the cabin, but they couldn't sleep. They were plagued by nightmares and visions of the forest around them dying. They knew that they had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to turn back. The next morning, they were finally able to leave the cabin. But they found that the forest had changed. The trees were dead and the animals were gone. They were alone in a barren wasteland, with only the cursed vase as their companion. Days turned into weeks, and the couple grew weaker and weaker. They knew that they were slowly dying, but they couldn't bear to part with the vase. It had become their only source of comfort, even though it had brought them to the brink of madness. Finally, on a cold winter day, they were found by a group of hikers. But it was too late for them. They had been consumed by the darkness of the cursed vase, and their souls had been forever tainted by its power. The hikers took the vase and left the forest, but they knew that they could never truly escape its curse. For the power of the vase was too great, and it would always find a way to haunt those who possessed it. And so, the legend of the cursed vase of Beloia's forest continued, a warning to all those who dared to seek out its power. For the cost of making a wish was too great, and the darkness it brought was too much for anyone to bear. It was a gorgeous autumn day when a group of friends set off on a hiking trip in the woods. However, they soon found themselves lost, and as nightfall approached, they stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin to take shelter in. But the night was filled with strange noises, and the group heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. It was a bright summer day when a group of friends went camping in the woods. As night fell, one camper, John, couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, he saw a shadow moving in the woods, and it turned out to be a living shadow, getting closer to the campsite. In short, a group of friends went hiking in the woods on a clear autumn day. They got lost, heard a blood-curdling scream, saw strange symbols on the trees, and encountered shadowy figures. 3 teenagers ventured into the forbidden Black Feather Woods on a dark and stormy night, in search of a hidden cabin rumored to be cursed. Inside, they found strange symbols carved into the walls and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. On a warm summer night, 5 friends ventured deep into the woods in search of a beautiful clearing to pitch their tents. As they sit around the campfire roasting marshmallows, they begin to hear a strange melody emanating from the trees. They soon see an old man playing a wooden flute with such skill that they become entranced. One day, a young couple named Peter and Maria decided to go on a hike in the forest and found the vase in an old cabin. Maria made a wish, but the forest around them began to die, And they found themselves trapped with a vase. They found themselves trapped with a vase. They found themselves trapped with a vase. They found themselves